Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the second session of this series. Today I'll be talking to you about how to outline your research paper. So for today's agenda, I'll be going through the main parts of a research paper. So the title or cover page, abstract, introduction, research design or methodology, results or findings, discussion, conclusion and references, and then other information you may or may not include in your research paper. And then like usual, we'll end with questions. Okay, so the first component of your research paper is the title or cover page. Depending on the journal or assignment, there might be different requirements in terms of what information is included on the cover page or what font size or font type you're allowed to use. The general format for a cover page is to include the title of your paper either at the top or in the center of the page, and then bold it. And then a few lines below the title, you'll include the names or the name of the authors. Then in the next line, you'll include the name of the university or college. On the next line, you'll write the address of the university or college, and then below that, the email of the corresponding author. And that is the email address of whoever is going to be handling any communication with either the journal or with other audiences. So, for example, if there's a student that's interested in learning more about your research paper, then they would contact the research team through the email of the corresponding author. The second part of your research paper is the abstract, which comes after the title or cover page. The abstract is very short and is usually only between 100 or 300 words long. And it's a very strict word limit, so you have to be very careful with your words and make sure you're using or communicating the most important information in your abstract. And usually this means summarizing your research paper for readers and including parts of your introduction, your methods, your results, and your discussion in your abstract, since those tend to be the most important parts of the research paper. And because you're summarizing parts of your paper that come after your abstract, it's actually easier to write the abstract when you're finished writing the rest of your research paper rather than writing the abstract at the beginning of your research paper. This is also where you would include any keywords related to your paper, and this is specifically for papers that are being published, and this is to help readers or students that are using literature for their research with finding relevant journal articles or relevant research papers related to whatever topic that they're interested in. So after the abstract is your introduction, and this is a descriptive portion of the paper, meaning that you're just briefly telling readers about information related to your research topic. So you're not really analyzing or interpreting any information just yet. Introductions usually start off with giving readers background information on the topic, like definitions related to the topic or a short history of the topic. Then you'll summarize existing research on your topic that is also relevant to your research question. You would then use this information to segue or move on into establishing the research problem or a major gap, limitation, or unexplored approach that has not been addressed by current research yet. And this gap, limitation, or unexplored approach should be one that will be addressed by your specific research paper. So after that, you will specify the objectives of your research, so the intent or why you're writing the research paper. Here you'll include either a hypothesis if you're testing the relationship between two variables. So for example, a hypothesis is an if-then statement. So if I change this or if this increases, then that will decrease, something like that. What is more common in a lot of fields is instead stating your research question in the form of a sentence. So, for example, this paper addresses like ethnic violence in the Balkans, for example. Lastly, you'll map out the rest of your paper. In this part, you will specifically write in the present tense. So you won't write this paper discussed or this paper will discuss, which is the future tense. You'll write this paper discusses. And this is where you'll describe the rest of the paper to readers in either one sentence or a few sentences. So you'll basically be summarizing or describing the rest of your paper. So the methodology, the results, and your discussion sections specifically. After your introduction is your research design or methodology section. This is where you'll describe what specific research design you used and why you used it, your research process, and any specific materials or equipment that you used. Depending on your research method, you'll also include additional information. So for example, if you're doing interviews as your data collection method, then you would include basic information about interviews that's relevant to the research question. So for example, if I'm investigating something that is related to age or geography, I would include the age of the participants, the interviewees, and the country of origin or the current location of interviewees. Specifically for interviews, but this is important in general. To preserve participant anonymity, you should never or will never include the names of interviewees. So you might use something like participant one, or you might use fake names, but you would never use the actual names of interviews, and you would never include a lot of personal information about interviewees that could be used to identify interviewees through your research. You'll also include limitations in your research design, and those are any potential shortfalls or gaps that could impact the results or findings of your research. So for example, if you're using interviews as your data collection method, you only interviewed a small number of people, like 5 or 6, then that would be a potential, or that would be a limitation that you would mention in your paper, because it means that your findings can't be generalized to the specific population that you're focusing on for your research paper. After your research design section, you'll write about your findings or your results. This is where you present your evidence and data that's related to your research question. In a lot of cases, you will have more than one finding, and some of those findings that might not actually be related to your research question. In this section, you only include results or findings that are actually related to your research question. Other findings that are interesting but they're not related to your research question would be included in a different section of your paper, usually the conclusion as a potential future area for research. Depending on whether your paper is based on qualitative or quantitative data, you'll have different types of evidence presented in the section. For quantitative research, which is research that's based off of numerical data, you would include for example, statistical tests, and then you would describe whether those tests were statistically significant or insignificant, and what the relationship is between the test and the test results and the research question. For qualitative research, you'll most likely write about your results based on themes or patterns in interviews or in the literature if you're doing like a systematic literature review or just a literature review. You also would not be interpreting any of your results in this section. So you'll simply be showing your results or your findings that you gained through the research that you did. So you won't be writing about what that actually means. that is what you will be doing in the next section, which is your discussion section. And this is where you'll interpret your results. So you'll basically be analyzing your results, answering the research question, discussing what your results or why your results are important to your field based on the potential outcomes or implications of your findings. This is where you can be speculative, so you can hypothesize and make claims like this. These results or this data might mean this, or this indicates that, or it appears that this means that, or something like that. Uh, Regardless of what speculations you make, though, you should still be basing these speculations off of your research findings. And in this section, you wouldn't include any new information from your research. So any information or any research or any findings, or results or findings that you want to talk about should have already been included in the previous section on results and findings. And then this is the last section before your references is your conclusion. And this is where you'll summarize your main findings and main interpretations. You can also include potential future directions for additional research. So like I mentioned earlier, if you found something through your research that is really interesting and something you really want to talk about and want to mention, but it isn't related to your actual research question, then that is something you could include here as a future direction or a future area of additional research that you could do in the future through a different research project. And after your conclusion, you'll include your references, and how you write your citations for your references will depend on the context you're writing the paper in. So you might be using a certain citation style based on the standards in your specific field of study. If you're publishing to a paper, they might have their own citation style that they want publisher or authors to use, and you might use that instead. Or if you're completing research as part of an assignment, your professor might have a specific citation style that they want all students to use, so you might use that instead. And then lastly is additional information that you might include if you're conducting research uh, inside or outside of the classroom, depending on the context. Funding is a major one. So if you're doing research that's being, and this is usually the case if you're doing research outside of the classroom, but if you're doing research that's being funded by like an organization, then you would include that information in either the paper, or it would be included in a specific document where you include um, additional information about your research paper if you're publishing to a journal. You might include an ethics statement, and it depends on the field. This isn't something that's always included in research papers, but this is just to make a claim that your research isn't being influenced by any like third parties. It's not ethical. It's not being funded by groups with special interest, and those groups want specific results from research that would support the organization, stuff like that. You might also include a biography, and this is something that usually goes, well, it usually goes in the beginning of your research paper on your title page or your cover page. You might include a positionality statement, which is something that's relatively new, and it's not something that's included in a lot of papers, but depending on the topic, it might be relevant to include this. A positionality statement is, um, it basically describes your identity and your relationship to the research topic. It's different from a biography, in that biographies are really about your academic background and your uh, experience in your area of expertise or your field of study. It's basically where you include all information that justifies why you are able to write about the topic. Positionality statements are more about who you are as a person and what role that plays in the topic. So, for example, if I'm writing a research paper about international student experiences at a rural college, um, and I myself am an international student, then I could write a positionality statement about the fact that I'm an international student and that has influenced why I decided to write about this topic and it influenced my experience being in the US or influenced my identity and stuff like that. You can also include an appendix and footnotes, and that's just if you have any other like tables or results of your test. Usually those come with some kind of graphic. That kind of stuff can be included in the appendix. Footnotes is usually where you include additional information outside of your citations and references. Okay, so that is all for this presentation. We'll be having more sessions next week, or this week. Tomorrow we'll be having a session on finding and exploring sources, and on Wednesday we'll be going over sorting and evaluating data. And then next week, I'll be presenting on how to present at research conferences and about attending research conferences. And all of these sessions will be at 3 p.m. Kazakhstan time. So here's our contact information. If you have any questions after the session, you can contact my supervisor, Donna Nakayeva, through WhatsApp at +7 701 266 9680, or through email at dnakaeva@educationusa.org. You can contact me through WhatsApp at +7 705 985 7408, or through email at qtownsend@middlebury.edu. You can scan this QR code to access the extra materials for this session and for last session for the students that were asking for it. The document also includes a link to the folder that has the recording from the last session, and we'll have the recording for today's session once the session is over. Okay, so that is all for this presentation. Thank you for coming and for listening. And if you have any questions, I'll be taking those starting now.